one of the themes today really has been clearly tribalism. I was particularly struck by that comment by one of the, a comment this morning, that's not racism, that's tribalism. And there was a lot of knowing nods there. And David's story about how you can even get back to tribalism by way of too much individualism. Tribalism is the difficulty that we're having now, that it's coming out in a particular form. We're seeing it in a particularly toxic form now, in a particularly intense form. And what I've been thinking a lot about recently, as I've been watching our problems in America and seeing that it's not just us, seeing that these problems are happening in a lot of countries, what I'm coming to think about is what the founding fathers thought of democracy. They didn't think much of it. They thought that this is a form that inevitably decays into tyranny because the majority will oppress the minority. And I think Madison said something like, and such direct democracies have ever been turbulent in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. So they were very aware of faction or tribalism. And somehow in the 20th century, late 20th century, we got fooled into thinking that democracy is easy. We thought after the end of the Soviet Union, we thought this was the end of history. Not that nothing's going to happen again, but that there's a direction, an end to development, so that eventually North Korea and Iran will be secular free market democracies. That's the inevitable direction that all countries take, we thought. But now it seems that a secular liberal democracy is much more difficult than we thought. In fact, you almost might think, given our evolutionary history as tribal creatures living in small communities with intense animistic religion and violent intergroup conflict, that's the human norm. So you might think a secular liberal democracy is nearly impossible. It is possible because we've done it, but I think the margin for error is very small, and we are now outside the operating parameters. Let's look at some of the factors that came together in the late 20th century to make it easy for us to cohere. Obviously, there was the 60s. It's not that it was easy, but the direction of America as the winning country of the 20th century was an illusion in part for these reasons. So here are a few forces. The best way to bind a group together is to have a common enemy, especially one that attacks you in, a surprise attack. So from 1941 through 1992, we had fantastic enemies to join together against. And that also shaped a generation, the greatest generation. My parents were so formed by World War II, as many of your parents or grandparents were. And of course, they stepped off the stage beginning in the 1990s and certainly by the early 2000s. Another factor, we had psychologically mixed parties. Until the 1980s, you had liberal Republicans, you had conservative Democrats, but we started a process in the 70s and into the 80s in which all the people with one kind of psychology were in one party and all the people with another kind in another, so that now you really could hate the other kind because they really were different, much more different than they were up until the 1960s. We also had, throughout the 20th century, we had very low rates of immigration. Now, immigration is wonderful for the economy, for innovation. Immigration does a lot of good things, but from a sociological perspective, immigration creates many more fault lines. Immigration reduces several kinds of social capital. So I'm just saying a lot of things lined up so that the centralizing or centripetal forces were really strong in the late 20th century. And the centrifugal, the forces blowing us outward like a centrifuge, those forces were not as strong as they are now. The last one, possibly the most important of all, is the media environment. The media has always been incredibly polarizing and full of lies, except for this brief period after television was invented when we had 3 television networks that were bound by the fairness doctrine. So we had this brief period, which is all of the stuff that us older people remember from the 20th century, a brief period where we all got our news from the same 3 sources, we all had a common set of facts. That was just a few decades in this nation's history, and now that is long gone. Cable TV began the erosion of it, the internet made it even more, and social media far more. So my point is, there was a temporary period in which the centripetal forces greatly exceeded the centrifugal forces, and we thought that it was the end of history. Democracy is easy or inevitable, and we were wrong. Now, these trends I've mentioned are very hard to reverse. Most likely, even after Donald Trump leaves the White House, we will continue the long march of polarization that we've been on since about 2004. The survey data shows increasing cross-partisan hatred really rising up after 2004, steadily, very steadily. So that's going to keep going, which means that the work that weavers are doing is more essential than ever. We have a headwind. Things are going to be more difficult 5 or 10 years from now than they are today. We really need to ramp it up. We really need to do our work. But we have to recognize that there are a lot of forces that are pulling the loom apart.
Okay, for me, at 23, I was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, but the judge didn't say 25 years. He said 300 months. And I'm very good at basic math, right? But I added up 300 months in my head, but I added it up in weeks, and that came out to around 6 years. And I was like, nah, I'm in more trouble than that, right? And so, they clarified it for me. And so I was sent off to a federal prison in Oxford, Wisconsin. And when I got to the prison, I was the youngest person there with the most time. And so, to me, I understood the lifestyle that I was living as a drug dealer, that there was consequences to what I was doing. And so there was death or there was jail. And so I won. I didn't die. I was in jail. And I had to look at how did I get there. But I also had to look at how was I going to make it through there. And let me just tell you a story. So my first criminal act was I stole a candy bar out the store. But to steal a candy bar at the counter, you got to take it and then you got to walk through the whole store, put it in your pocket, and then walk out the front door. That was my first traumatic experience, because through that whole journey of taking the candy bar and walking through the store and walking out the store, I always felt like somebody had seen me. And I felt like at some point in time, somebody was going to grab me. And that's all I was waiting on and expecting. But I kept walking, and I got out the store, and I got down the street, and I was still shaking a little bit, but I opened the Snickers and ate it, and I felt good. And I did it again. And so that was the first traumatic experience I had that was never addressed. And so I end up in prison, and I'm in here, and these ghosts is revisiting me, because in federal prison, much different than state prison, they have more control. So you have more freedom. But every night, we all get the same thing. We get locked in the cell, steel door shuts, lights go out, but no one really goes to sleep. Everybody is looking up, whether you're on the bottom bunk looking at the top of the bunk or you're looking at the ceiling. Everybody's looking up, and they're being revisited by all those things they did, but most importantly, all the things that was done to them to have them to wind up in that position. And in prison, no one is trying to work that out for you. No one's trying to help you with that. They're there to punish you and make you pay your debt to society. And for me, we didn't start, but the psychology department started a juvenile awareness group. So we're in Oxford, Wisconsin, and all these surrounding communities who had young people that was doing some minute things that somebody knew could turn into something bigger. Start bringing the kids in twice a week, Tuesday and Thursday. And then on Friday, we would meet in the psychologist's office, and we would discuss how that went and read some of the letters that was returned to the prison. No names, no addresses, just people saying how this impacted them. And then we was only there for an hour, but the other 11 people would get up and leave out. I would still sit there, and I would talk to the psychologist. And here's was the first thing I noticed. He wasn't trying to fix me. He wasn't trying to diagnose me. He was allowing me to talk through what I had been through. And so that's how that journey started. Prison is probably sort of like war. You know, there's battles going on inside and outside. For me, what happened was that I graduated, got a couple of degrees, and I started teaching when I got moved to the Milan Federal Correctional Institution. They're the only institution with a high school in it where you actually get a high school diploma. And I was teaching conflict resolution, and I was frustrated because I thought the men wasn't getting it, right? I'm saying these are the things you're going to encounter. You're going to have this happen, and then they were coming back, and it was getting frustrated. But what I realized is that I still had 6 years left. I taught this for 2 years, and then I was released immediately. I got an early release. So 4 years was left on my sentence that was just wiped out. I was sent home. What I came to realize is that as I was teaching people to integrate society, I was actually teaching myself how to integrate back into society. And the tools I was trying to share with them, I was actually reinforcing within myself about, there's going to be probably people who's not going to give me a job. It's going to be hard finding housing. So I'm going to have to volunteer. I'm going to have to volunteer with a volunteer's heart. What does that mean? I can't come to your organization and say, hey, I want to help, but then ask you for a bus card. Because I'm not doing that from my heart. I'm doing it for a bus card. And so I understood that, and I knew this. And so that's what I had to do. And so that helped me as I started to help people who were struggling in the streets, those returning home, those involved in violence, right? I could relate to them because I had been in that area, but I also had got the help. And I wasn't trying to tell them what they needed. I was just sharing what I had got and how it had helped me. If we're all honest with ourselves, and I don't care, and I know everybody here has gotten some help, and I love David telling us his story about him getting to the second mountain, and I love Sarah telling us about what she went through, and that's taking that trauma and turning it around. But if we're all honest in this room, we're all holding on to one piece of trauma that we won't share yet, that's still holding us down. And I'm going to go out on a limb. I believe we all are.
If we can allow it, the trauma has the potential to offer us a gift. And for me, it was the realization that those who we seek to destroy, our enemies, live and breathe inside us, inside me. To put it in Joseph Campbell terms, the hero goes out on a quest to slay the dragon. And as he plunges his sword deep into the heart of the monster, he looks one last time into its eyes, and he sees only himself. And when you're able to peel that back a bit, what you begin to see is a lot of commonality among all of us.
The Sufi poet Rumi says, the wound is where the light enters. And that's what you sound like to me.
And I'll just tell one story of this from Sarah's organization, Thread, in Baltimore. So she is a woman on her board named Michelle. And Michelle, I think, works in finance. The ethos at Thread, the moral ecology at Thread, is, I think they have a phrase, showing all the way up and calling a thing, which is complete vulnerability. You just are completely vulnerable with the people around you. And that is within the organization with the young people and the adults, but it's also on the board. And so even on the board meetings, they go through complete vulnerability and complete sharing. And so the ethos had such an effect on Michelle, she decided to tell the board a story about herself that she'd never even told, I think, her husband or family. And that was a story about her childhood. And her childhood was not a good one. Her father was abusive and would hit her. And Michelle is Asian American, and she said she was glad that she had thick black hair because it hid the welts from when her father punched her in the head when she went to school. And roundabout when she was 14, she tried to take her own life by swallowing a bunch of pills and realized how hard it is to swallow 100 pills. Your throat clenches up. And she shared this story with the board. And having shared it with the board, she decided she would share it with her family. And she wrote a letter, which Sarah passed on to me, and then Michelle gave me permission to put it in the book. And the letter, she's telling what happened to her. She writes, I remember clearly what it's like to be 14 and feel trapped and powerless. And that's why I show up to Thread. Thread has given me the gift of the Thread lens. At this point, my Thread lens has allowed me to examine my weaknesses. The Thread lens has allowed me to recognize the richness of relationships. So that Thread lens is the moral ecology we see the world through after we've been changed. And at one point, she took her daughter to an Elton John concert in Baltimore. And Elton John was the soundtrack to her life when she was at her lowest. And she's watching Elton John, and she's with her 13-year-old daughter, and she starts weeping at the concert. And she writes of that experience, I wasn't crying because I was sad. I was overcome by emotions as my mind whipsawed between the stark contrast of my bleak childhood and my splendid adult life. I was listening to his music with my 13-year-old daughter, both of us laughing. My life is now rich with strong and healthy relationships. Life has turned out to be so much better than I ever imagined.